Imagine a river in East Java in the late months of 1965. The water doesn't look like water anymore. It is a thick, sluggish sludge of crimson, clogged so densely with headless torsos that the current has simply given up. For months, the villagers don't eat fish because the fish have been feasting on their neighbors. This is the year of living dangerously, the moment Indonesia decided to perform a lobotomy on its own soul, murdering up to 1 million of its own people in a fever dream of anti-communist paranoia. And yet, if you fly over those same rivers today, you see a shimmering, hyper-digital G20 nation of 280 million people, scrolling through TikTok and building unicorn startups. This is the central sickening paradox of Indonesia. It is a masterpiece built on a mass grave. It shouldn't exist. It's a splatter of 17,000 islands that was never meant to be a country. It was meant to be a warehouse, then a prison, then a graveyard. But somehow, through a mix of sheer geological spite and a terrifying will to survive, it became a titan. To understand Indonesia, you have to stop thinking about tropical paradises and start thinking about a survival thriller where the main character is a mosaic that refuses to shatter, even when the earth itself tries to swallow it whole. Let's talk about the landlord from hell. Indonesia doesn't just sit on land, it sits on a tectonic lottery. This is the Ring of Fire, a place where the earth's crust is basically a set of jagged teeth grinding against each other. You aren't living on territory. You are squatting on the back of 140 active volcanoes. These aren't just mountains. They are the archipelago's erratic, fire-breathing deities. In 1815, a volcano called Tambora didn't just erupt. It screamed so loud it caused a year without a summer in Europe and North America, causing global crop failures and riots. This geography isn't a foundation. It's a monster. It demands a blood sacrifice of stability every few generations. This creates a specific, haunted psychology in the Indonesian people. A deep-seated understanding that everything you build can be erased in a single afternoon by a tsunami or a pyroclastic flow. The result? A nation of people who are masters of the pivot. They don't plan for centuries. They plan for the next breath. Since the first mariners navigated these waters, the goal hasn't been to conquer the land. It's been to outrun the fire. But the fire from the earth was nothing compared to the fire from the west. Enter the ultimate cinematic villain, the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company. Forget everything you know about colonization. This wasn't a king claiming territory for God and country. This was a hostile corporate takeover by the world's first trillion-dollar mega-corporation. In the 1600s, the Dutch were obsessed with a flavor, nutmeg and cloves. These little seeds were the Bitcoin of the 17th century, and they only grew on a few tiny volcanic specks called the Maluku Islands. The VOC didn't want to govern. They wanted to balance a ledger. They showed up with private armies and a mandate to maximize shareholder value by any means necessary. In the Banda Islands, when the locals dared to trade with anyone else, the VOC performed a system reset. They didn't just punish the islanders. They practiced corporate genocide, wiping out the entire population and replacing them with slaves and company overseers. Imagine the irony. The very first time these islands were unified under one administration, it was as a giant, blood-soaked spice warehouse. The Dutch didn't see people. They saw inventory. For 350 years, they treated this archipelago like a lemon, squeezing every drop of resource into the canals of Amsterdam until the people were nothing but rinds. The monster in a rough collar was efficient. To make the extraction easier, the Dutch treated 17,000 diverse cultures as a single administrative unit. It was the greatest backfire in history. By grouping the headhunters of Sumatra, the aristocrats of Java, and the sailors of Sulawesi under one East Indies label, the Dutch accidentally gave them a common identity. They gave them a shared trauma. By the early 20th century, the interns were ready to kill the CEOs. In 1928, a group of young, Dutch-educated activists did something that sounded like a suicide pact. They gathered in Jakarta and took the youth pledge. They didn't have a single gun or a single cent. But they staged a linguistic heist. They chose a minority trade language, Malay, and rebranded it as Indonesian. They were building a nation out of thin air. using words to glue 17,000 islands together. It was a beautiful, desperate lie that they eventually made true through sheer, stubborn repetition. They decided that if the Dutch were going to treat them like one colony to be exploited, they would act like one nation to be liberated. It was the birth of a dream inside a cage. Then the cage was smashed by a bigger monster. 1942. The Japanese Empire swept through the islands like a fever. For the Indonesians, watching their invincible Dutch masters being marched into labor camps in their underwear was a psychedelic experience. The myth of white superiority didn't just crack, it evaporated. But the Japanese weren't liberators, they were vampires. They drained the islands of rice, rubber, and men for their Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was just fancy branding for a slave empire. When Japan finally surrendered in 1945, there was a 4-day window of absolute silence. It was a vacuum of power. In that moment, a man named Sukarno, a silver-tongued orator who could charm the scales off a snake, stood on a porch and read a 2-paragraph statement. "We, the people of Indonesia, hereby declare our independence." He didn't ask. He didn't negotiate. He just hit the publish button on a nation that didn't have a single tank to defend itself. What followed was 4 years of pure visceral carnage. The Dutch returned, backed by British guns, screaming about their property rights. They called their invasion police actions, as if they were just clearing out some unruly tenants. The Indonesians called it a revolution. This is the part where the camera zooms in on the Pemuda, the revolutionary youth. Picture a 20-year-old in a sarong, clutching a bamboo spear sharpened to a needlepoint, charging a Dutch tank in the streets of Surabaya. It was a war of the shadows. It was a mother in a village hiding a rebel fighter in a rice bin while Dutch soldiers burned her house down. The irony? The Dutch were fighting to keep a spice island that no longer mattered, using money they didn't have, against a people who had already decided they were dead if they weren't free. By 1949, the Dutch finally choked on their own greed and left. But they left behind a country that was essentially a pile of smoking ruins, a population that couldn't read, and a political system that was a ticking time bomb. Enter the era of the strongmen. Sukarno, the founding father, was a romantic who thought he could run a country on vibe alone. He built massive phallic monuments in Jakarta and told the West to go to hell with your aid while his people were eating corn husks. He tried to balance the army, the Islamists, and the world's third-largest communist party like a man juggling grenades on a sinking ship. In 1965, the pins were pulled. The Year of Living Dangerously wasn't a movie title. It was a reality. After a murky coup attempt, the country went into a collective, murderous psychosis. The purge was so systematic, so intimate, that neighbors were killing neighbors with machetes just to prove they weren't red. When the blood finally dried, General Suharto was standing over the wreckage. He was the smiling general, the man who promised order at the cost of your voice. For 32 years, he ran Indonesia like a high-security prison that happened to have a decent GDP growth rate. He invited the World Bank and the IMF in, paved the roads, built the schools, and made sure his family owned every toll road and clove plantation in the country. It was a gilded cage, and for a while, the world praised him for it. But the order was a lie built on a house of cards. In 1998, the Asian financial crisis hit, and the cards blew away in a single weekend. The Indonesian rupiah turned into wallpaper. The rice that Suharto promised was gone, so the order collapsed. The streets of Jakarta turned into a war zone of looting and fire. Students occupied the parliament building, staring down snipers. Everyone, literally everyone, expected Indonesia to do a Yugoslavia. They expected the islands to break away, the Christians and Muslims to start a holy war, and the military to stage a massacre. But here is the most incredible irony of the whole story. They didn't. In the middle of the fire, Indonesia chose reformasi. They didn't just change leaders. They decentralized the entire country. They gave power back to the islands, they freed the press, and they became the world's most improbable, loud, and messy democracy. They chose to stay together not because they had to, but because after 500 years of monsters, they realized they were the only ones who had each other's backs. Now, Look at the present. Indonesia is ghosting its own history. In Jakarta, the skyscrapers are gleaming, the malls are full of luxury brands, and the tech unicorns are booming. But the city itself is sinking. It is the fastest sinking city on the planet, literally drowning under the weight of its own ambition and a rising ocean. So, what does the nation do? In a move that is peak Indonesian, they are abandoning the sinking ship and building a brand new capital, Nusantara, in the middle of the Borneo rainforest. It's a multi-billion-dollar Hail Mary, a desperate bet that they can simply Control+Alt+Delete their way into a new future. It's a project that is equal parts visionary and insane. They are carving a smart city out of the ancient lungs of the earth, hoping that this time the landlord won't notice. So what is the cost of this 500-year survival? The cost is a nation that has learned to live with a selective memory. To keep the 17,000 islands together, they've had to bury the ghosts of 1965 deep in the volcanic soil. They've had to trade total justice for a fragile working peace. They are a people who have survived corporate genocide, world wars, domestic massacres, and dictatorships by becoming the ultimate shapeshifters. They are a mosaic that is held together by the scars of the glue. As the sun sets over the sinking towers of Jakarta and rises over the bulldozers in Borneo, you have to ask yourself, how many times can a nation reinvent itself before it forgets who it originally was? Indonesia is a miracle, yes, but it is a miracle that lives on a knife's edge. It is a nation that proves you can build a future on a nightmare as long as you never stop moving. But as the volcanoes continue to simmer and the oceans continue to rise, the question isn't whether Indonesia will succeed. The question is, what happens when the persistence finally runs out of land to move to? Are they a blueprint for a resilient future, or are they just the world's most beautiful sinking warning?